If you're a fan of college football video games, then I'm sure you're excited by that news from early 2021 that EA Sports will finally be reviving its long-dormant college football series, even though they will be doing so without the NCAA license and also under a new title, EA Sports College Football. I guess Bill Walsh wasn't available for licensing either. Expectations are that the first entry in this new line of college football video games won't release until at least July of 2023, so we still have another year or more before we'll be playing a new college football game on our home consoles. Sadly, we might not even have Maximum Football to fill that niche void anymore, since it's unclear if its new developer Modus Games will retain the College Dynasty mode or if it will be as good. Hopefully they do, and hopefully it's better. With EA Sports' return to college football now imminent, I feel it's important to take a look at one of the most beloved features in EA's old NCAA football video game series and examine why that feature worked so well, why it absolutely must return, and where it may have in some places faltered, and how EA could potentially further improve it. I'm going to approach this topic in a manner very similar to my essay about the preseason of Madden. I'll start by explaining why I enjoy the feature. I'll compare and contrast it with other iterations of the same feature in alternate versions of the game to show different approaches and how well they work relative to one another. Then, I'll take the important points from the early sections and provide my own suggestions for how the feature can be improved in the future to emphasize its strengths and hopefully minimize its weaknesses. And it's kind of funny seeing how this series has been elevated onto a pedestal since its cancellation in 2013. If you actually go back and look at contemporary reviews and user scores, they were often mixed or negative for EA's NCAA football games, and often aligned very closely with Madden's reception at the time. Yet now, NCAA Football 14 is often held up as one of the best sports games ever, and definitely one of the best football games ever. Are we looking back with rose-tinted glasses, or was NCAA football always an underappreciated gem? I think the answer is a little bit of both, and we'll explore why in the coming discussion. In any case, the NCAA football games seem to enjoy a much more cult-like status compared to Madden, with its loyal fan base often insisting that the college game was better than its more mainstream big brother. And that might be true. Being the smaller cousin of Madden, I think the developers of NCAA football had a little bit of a longer leash. Lower expectation and sales requirements might have led to less overhead from both the NCAA and from Electronic Arts itself, which gave the studio a bit more leeway to experiment with new and novel ideas, some of which worked and some of it didn't. The studio also benefited from technological hand-me-downs from Big Brother Madden's development process, which may have freed up even more resources for building supporting features rather than having to spend as much time on the underlying game engine. By the time of the game's cancellation, it had been receiving yearly engine, AI, and graphics upgrades that had been developed by the Madden team. Robust customization features such as Team Builder and Stadium Sounds allowed for a great deal of personalization that helped to connect the user more to their NCAA football game. Trophies from rivalry games, bowls, and conference championships provided challenges and collectibles that encouraged users to play the game with other teams in both Play Now and Dynasty modes. And the college atmosphere provided pageantry and energy on the field that Madden largely lacked. In fact, things have kind of come full circle with Madden 22, which is now stealing features from NCAA 14 for its next-gen release. I think most people will agree that the true highlight of the NCAA football games is its Dynasty mode's in-season recruiting feature. It was a surprisingly deep and rewarding experience that gave a sense of humanity to the process of recruiting high school athletes to help develop your team. Compare this to Madden's franchise mode, which has usually been played more from a perspective of finances. There have been exceptions during Madden's long history, but that game has almost always looked at the players on your roster more as commodities than as people. To be fair to Madden, this has a lot to do with the different business models of college football versus NFL teams. The NFL and its teams, with the sole and notable exception of the community-owned Green Bay Packers, are all private businesses, and they have a very corporate mindset. It's about making money. The NCAA is also a business, and a very profitable one at that, but the individual schools aren't, at least not technically and not all of them. Because of the illusion that it isn't a for-profit business, the dirty, exploitative corporate underbelly of the NCAA has long resisted paying its student athletes, and has repeatedly claimed that college sports are amateur athletics, even though football in particular generates billions of dollars in profits for colleges and conferences. This is slowly changing, and I think it's about time that we see some reform in college sports. Regardless of the politics, college football players haven't been paid in real life. So EA could not approach the team-building aspects of its NCAA football dynasty modes from the same business and economic perspective that drives Madden's franchise mode. Hey, don't complain to me about injecting politics into the video game, since the politics of the situation is already baked into the product. I'm just trying to explain how the real-world politics influences the design of the game in order to provide a little bit more context as to why the Dynasty mode isn't just a copy-paste of Madden's franchise mode, as so much else of the game is. NCAA football games also benefited by modeling the fact that college teams recruit athletes, instead of having to draft them, as is the case in most professional sports. This means that colleges have agency in which athletes they choose to recruit, and different colleges have to compete with each other to secure commitments from those athletes in order to attend their school instead of another. With players graduating after only 4 or 5 years on a team, and mostly only making significant contributions in their final year or two on the roster anyway, there's also a large amount of turnover in rosters on a year-to-year basis in college sports, which means that recruiting is a necessarily pervasive part of any university's year-to-year operations and planning. This is in stark contrast to a professional team, which only intermittently has to court a handful of free agents or propose trades with other teams. Well-run NFL teams can potentially go many years without large roster upheavals, and really only need to worry about rotating in background support players around fixed stars that may start with the team for 5, 10, or 15 years. Though to be fair, short-term free agent signings and trading of marquee players does seem to be becoming much more common in the NFL as more and more teams try to make a single-year run at a Super Bowl instead of trying to build a dynasty around a set of fixed stars. Universities, on the other hand, are looking to fully rebuild their roster every year or two. Enter NCAA's in-season recruiting feature. Right off the bat, relying on recruiting as the method of team building means that the NCAA football dynasty mode has an edge over Madden's franchise mode because that recruiting creates off-field competition to supplement the on-field competition. Most weeks in Madden, you end the match, return to the franchise menu, and immediately jump into next week's match with little to no overhead. Or you turn the game off because it sucks, and you try to get as much of your money back as possible by selling it on eBay. If you do stick with Madden, then every now and then you may have to stop to put a player on injured reserve and look for a free agent replacement, but for the most part, the week between matches is uneventful. Madden has struggled for years, maybe even decades, trying to find compelling activities for users to engage with during the simulated weeks in between football matches, and it hasn't really had a whole lot of success, especially recently. In NCAA football, however, your time between every single match is spent working towards building your roster for between 1 to 5 years down the road. And best of all, this roster building is a continuous, competitive process. You search through lists of available players, highlighting the ones you want, and spend points to scout them and make sure that they will positively contribute to your team. Then you spend time each week trying to convince those athletes to sign with your school. All the while, the other schools in the game might also be actively trying to recruit those same athletes. This creates a simple and straightforward weekly strategy of trying to best allocate your available hours to scout and recruit enough players to fill all your positions of need and to maintain adequate depth at other positions, or to find a star or diamond in the rough. But there's also several long-term meta strategies going on as well. You'll also be choosing which states you want to focus your recruiting efforts on. Having a certain threshold of players on your team from a certain state turns that state into a pipeline state, which makes recruiting pitches generate more interest when used on prospects from that state. There's also promises, which, if fulfilled, improve your coach's integrity, which makes future promises to prospects more valuable. All of this combines to create an addictive, one more week aspect to the in-season recruiting. While I might turn Madden off after playing a particular franchise week's game because there was nothing much else to do, the in-season recruiting of NCAA would have me wanting to progress to the next week to find out how my recruiting efforts have played out. Once I'm in the next week, I'm more inclined to impulsively start that week's recruiting process. I would often advance to the next week and play the football match just to get back to the recruiting and continue battling against other schools to secure commitments from my preferred prospects. Heck, sometimes I'd even be excited to see that I have a bye week next in the schedule, because it means I could go straight to more recruiting without having to bother with the meddlesome football in between. Ooh, I can't wait to play this upcoming bye week, said absolutely no Madden player ever. This one more week addictiveness would sometimes have me up well past midnight on school or work nights. The in-season recruiting can actually stand on its own as a game, even without needing to play out the actual football matches on the field. Simply having a competitive activity to do between the weekly football matches by itself gives NCAA football an engaging feature that Madden has largely lacked. But what really pushed the NCAA football games over the edge, at least in my opinion, is how much humanity Tiburon was able to inject into this process. The user would be expected to keep in near weekly contact with your key prospects by calling them to sing the praises of your school and football program, while also reminding the prospects that the other schools offering him scholarships just aren't as good as your school. Each prospect would have a distinct set of desires for what he wants in a school or team, and it would be up to the user to find out what those are. You would then try to filter out the recruits whose interests do not align with your school's strengths, and then laser focus on the recruits who match up the best. But if you really want a particular talented recruit, you can always try to change his mind about a particular desire. You could also let the prospect himself guide parts of the conversation, essentially listening to what he wants or doesn't want from a school, and he'd be more appreciative of you letting him ramble about a topic on his mind, even if the chosen topic doesn't exactly cast your school in the best of light. You could even make promises to the recruits about whether they would be starters, that you would win bowl games or championships during their careers, or that they would get lots of attention from professional scouts. If you fail to fulfill those promises after signing the player, he might attempt to transfer to another school, and your reputation as a recruiter and coach would be damaged for a long time. What's more, having put all that effort into carefully selecting prospects to recruit, scouting them, and then actually recruiting them over the course of the entire season, it's so immensely gratifying to see them be successful on the field. There's a degree of virtual pride in seeing all that time and effort pay off for me, my team, and especially for the player I recruited. This is another thing that Madden just doesn't quite capture, because so little effort goes into drafting and developing a player. You fully scout each draftee almost instantly, and just pick the best player on the board when your turn comes around to draft. It's certainly nice to see your drafted players having success, but it doesn't feel like the culmination of months or years of work the way that the similar success in NCAA feels. And the scouting overhaul, added by a post-release patch to Madden 22, somehow actually managed to make this boring process even more passive and boring. This is probably especially true when playing as a lower-tier school in NCAA football. UNLV is not starting at the top of any 3 or 4 or 5-star recruits list. Successfully recruiting mid to high value prospects requires that a school like UNLV scratch and claw its way to the top of the prospect's preferred schools list. and then also keep fighting to stay there and fend off the other schools that have so many more advantages over lowly UNLV. And yeah, it's true that this whole process is literally just a matter of min-maxing some numbers, and that process is actually surprisingly transparent to the user. The game shows you all of the numbers. There wasn't a whole lot in the way of social simulation going on here. But the way that the process was framed, as a conversation, as a dialogue, combined to make the recruits feel less like a collection of skill attributes on a spreadsheet and more like actual characters with personalities. Recruits became more than just a list of 40-yard dash times, bench press reps, and vertical jump heights. They had likes, dislikes, ambitions, and dreams, which all gave the recruits a certain degree of humanity. A humanity that Madden's scouting, drafting, and contract negotiation process simply cannot emulate. Here's just a small example of what this kind of feature adds to the game. I am subbing in a 69 overall kicker. Josh White here is an objectively worse kicker compared to the starter Aaron Watkins, but I promised Josh when I was recruiting him that he would get playing time his first year. So I'm subbing him in for extra points and short field goals because, damn it, I intend to keep that promise. I recruited Josh because my starting kicker was a junior, and I wanted to make sure I'd have a viable kicker to replace him with when he graduates, and then also have a year to develop that new kicker so that I don't get stuck with a really, really awful walk-on. If I had redshirted Josh and not given him any playing time, he'd be liable to transfer, and I'd be left without a kicker at all. Also, failing to keep promises makes other prospects less interested in the promises that I do make. So breaking that playing time promise is not only bad for Josh, but it would be bad for my future recruiting efforts as well. Giving Josh here those opportunities to make easy kicks is a long-term strategic decision, but honoring those promises is also just the right thing to do. And it's not like my starting kicker, Aaron Watkins, was a clutch kicker anyway. I think that this humanity is perhaps the biggest factor in the success of the NCAA football video game series, and why fans today still hold these games up in such high regard, and have been clamoring for the series' return for almost 10 years. The on-field gameplay was largely copy-pasted from Madden, with many of the same problems with the physics engine, AI, game scripting, and game pacing, though the college theme does actually go a long way towards mitigating some of these problems in the eyes of many gamers, because these are young amateur athletes still learning the game who are prone to mistakes, instead of being supposedly trained professional athletes who represent the best football players in the world. So, kind of makes sense that their AI is not that great. In any case, that off-field recruiting gameplay gave the NCAA games a heart and soul and character that made the game overall genuinely good, in spite of any perceived or real deficiencies in the on-field gameplay. NCAA football's Dynasty mode stood head and shoulders over anything Madden had ever done, even to this day. The closest that Madden ever gets to something like this is with role-specific players. For example, I drafted Dakota Stallings here as a middle linebacker in Madden 23 because I knew that I probably wouldn't be holding on to Khalil Mack or Danny Trevathan much longer, assuming they don't retire before I have a chance to trade them away. Trevathan has a lower overall rating, but his awareness and play recognition are much higher, and he fills my scheme's chemistry for whatever the heck that's worth in this game. So I use him as my second inside linebacker in my 3-4 base sets. Stallings is more athletic, so he's my user-controlled sub-linebacker for passing downs. I also manually sub him into the base set for 5-minute drills whenever I'm protecting a lead. But even in this situation, I'm playing this rookie because he is situationally better than the other player in the depth chart. It isn't because I feel any sense of obligation to play my drafted rookie, especially not on any sort of personal level. There's no humanity in my decision. It's just a numbers game, just like all the decisions in Madden are just numbers games. Fans seem to have lionized EA's NCAA Football 14 as the second best football game ever behind NFL 2K5 by the simple virtue of NCAA football having been the last NCAA football game that EA developed and released. The acclaim isn't completely undeserved. I personally always liked EA's NCAA football games more than Madden, going as far back as the early years of the PS2, and NCAA Football 14 was probably the last truly good football game that EA has produced. But this is where things might start to get controversial for this video. Because if I'm being perfectly honest, as good as NCAA 14 is, if I were stuck on a desert island with only one college football game, I think I might actually prefer to have NCAA Football 13 instead of 14. The reason for this is that the heart and soul of the NCAA football games for a long time had been the in-season recruiting, and this recruiting is the reason for playing the game. Well, NCAA 14 made some major changes to the in-season recruiting that, in my opinion, took away some of that humanity that I felt made the previous games so appealing and addictive. And a bit of an aside for some context, I also just have fonder memories of NCAA 13, which released in the fall of 2012, because 2013 happened to be a year in which I was just burnt out of football video games. 2009 through 2011 saw both Madden and NCAA fall into a particularly nasty slump in on-field quality that NCAA 12 and 13 only barely pulled themselves out from. I bought NCAA Football 14 when it was released, but I hardly played it, and I didn't even bother to buy that year's Madden at all, not even pre-owned. I figured I could just wait till next year's release when I would hopefully feel a bit more invigorated to play. Little did I know that there would be no next year for NCAA football. Regardless of these extenuating personal factors, and having gone back and played a lot of both NCAA Football 13 and 14 over the past year, seriously, my partner keeps complaining about being sick of staring at rosters and listening to the menu music. I still feel like NCAA Football 13 did its recruiting a little better than NCAA 14. NCAA Football 13 expected the user to specifically ask each and every prospect how he feels about each and every possible recruiting pitch, and then try to sell him on those pitches that best lined up with what he wants. Critics, rightfully so, complained that this process was tedious and time-consuming. It's a valid complaint. I certainly cannot tell those critics that they are wrong, and I'll talk more about that in the next video. In response, Tiburon tried to streamline the recruiting process for NCAA 14, and streamline is always kind of a scary word when you're talking about video games and software. Instead of explicitly calling each and every prospect every single week and interviewing them about each and every pitch, in NCAA Football 14, you simply allocate points to each prospect and let the CPU handle the actual interviews in the background. The following week, you simply check the numbers to see if your school had gone up or down in the prospect's priority list, and then adjust your points for the following week accordingly. On paper, it's virtually the same system, except without all the extra overhead and extra inputs of going pitch by pitch, prospect by prospect. It was indeed quite streamlined. But sometimes the more efficient mechanic isn't necessarily the best mechanic. You see, the more streamlined, automated recruiting process of NCAA 14, while functional and efficient, had the subtle but noticeable effect of making me feel less personally involved in the recruiting process and with the prospects themselves. I didn't even have to interact with the recruiting menu on a weekly basis if I didn't want to, because the CPU would use the same point allocations each week unless I changed it. Unless it's time to schedule a campus visit, or I notice my efforts towards recruiting a favorite prospect is losing ground to another school, or I have my favorite prospects locked in safely and want to shift attention to other recruits lower in my recruiting board, there isn't really much reason to even touch the recruiting in a given week, at least not once the scouting is done and all my points are being invested into recruiting. Not having to actually talk to each prospect also hid more of the virtual prospects' personalities behind a wall of numbers and reverted the prospects to feeling less like characters and more like the soulless numbers on a spreadsheet that we see in Madden. In fact, I don't have to engage with the prospect's pitch interests at all. or even know what his pitch interests are. So even if I am going into the recruiting menu every week in order to check on my progress and shift points around when necessary, I'm still never really getting a feel for who these prospects might be as people. They're just names, predicted overall ratings, and a home state. This system of simply allocating points reminds me of the old PS2 era games. Yet, even in those old PS2 games, the whole purpose of spending recruiting points on the prospects was to figure out each prospect's pitch interest and how they lined up with your school so that you could use that optimal pitch for the eventual campus visit. That little shred of humanity and characterization was there all the way back in 2005 and maybe even earlier. I don't have earlier versions of the game to test. And when you do get to the off-season recruiting, the point allocations were ditched in favor of contacting each prospect each week to discuss a specific pitch. Granted, there were only about a half dozen to a dozen prospects on the board instead of the 35 allowed in NCAA 13 and 14, but it still meant you were actively engaged in that dialogue with the prospect, all the way back on the PlayStation 2. NCAA 14 even took away the ability to make promises to the prospects for some reason. All those little miniature narratives about not redshirting a player, making sure a player gets enough playing time, or making sure that I schedule a game in his home state so that mom and dad can see him play, those are just not present in NCAA 14 to give the recruiting that extra personal and emotional touch. In NCAA 13, I felt like I was role-playing being a coach, interviewing prospective players, and earning their trust. That feeling is just lost in NCAA 14 and becomes a simple process of min-maxing numbers, even more so than its predecessor. Promises still exist as a feature in NCAA 14, but as far as I know, you can only make promises to a player in order to prevent him from transferring to another school, or maybe also to talk him out of declaring for the pro draft early. I'm not sure, as that particular instance never came up in my games. But without having made specific pitches to the player to begin with, or having made specific promises to him, there's no broken promises to make me feel like it was my fault that the player isn't satisfied with his role on the team. Again, that humanity that was present in NCAA 13 is just stripped out in NCAA 14. And when you get to the off-season recruiting, the home stretch, the culmination of the entire year's worth of work, you only get a single opportunity in NCAA 14 to spend your remaining recruiting points. It's not broken up into a 5-week process like it was in NCAA Football 13. This means you have no opportunity to get a feel for how the CPU teams are using their points and to adjust your points accordingly. It also means that a CPU team can dump literally thousands of points into my preferred prospects and steal them from me, even if I went into the offseason with a comfortable buffer. Should I put thousands of points into this prospect in order to secure him, even if it means I risk overshooting by 1,000 and miss out on also signing other prospects? You have no opportunity to fall back on lower-rated prospects if your top prospects do commit to other teams. And this is perhaps the clearest example of how streamlining the mechanic isn't necessarily a better system. The fact that the game gives no indication of how many points the other schools might be spending on each prospect also makes the offseason recruiting feel like a total crapshoot, which, might I remind you, is the problem with drafting in Madden. Worst of all is that all of this, combined with the super quick process of allocating all your points for the entire offseason at once, really encourages a lot of save scumming. If your preferred prospects go to other teams, it's quick and easy to just reload the save, assuming you disabled autosaved or kept a backup from before the offseason, and then reallocate your points. Heck, even if you did get that prospect, but you overshot him by 1,000 points and couldn't afford to sign lower-rated reserves for depth, it's, again, easy to reload and redistribute the points to secure more prospects more efficiently. I often find myself cheating and save scumming to find out what the CPU teams do spend on my top prospects so that I can spend the minimum amount to maintain a small buffer and still have extra points to spread around to my low-caliber reserve prospects. But even then, I found that the CPU will just dump extra points into certain high-ranked prospects after I save scum and put more of my own points into them. It's as if the CPU teams know how many points the player is spending and is able to add just a few more points to steal them away from me. This looks a hell of a lot like the CPU is cheating in order to create a false illusion of difficulty. Once again, say what you will about NCAA 13's recruiting being slow and tedious, but the mechanics rarely, if ever, encouraged or necessitated save scumming. And that lengthier process strongly discourages save scumming from a simple time-wasting perspective. Don't get me wrong, NCAA Football 14 is still good, and definitely better than what Madden was offering then, and probably better than what Madden has offered since. Even though the game shows all the numbers to the user, the list of available prospects and the limited resources at the user's disposal still meant that vital judgment calls had to be made, and your success or failure hinges on those decisions. Again, this is a huge improvement over Madden, in which the draft process is so random and scouting resources are so plentiful, or just completely repetitive and meaningless in the case of Madden 22's scouting update, that my decisions feel largely moot. Regardless of NCAA Football 14 still working better than Madden, the changes to recruiting felt like a substantial regression, more in the direction of Madden's uninspired scouting and draft process. The slower process from NCAA 13 of calling each and every prospect every week may have been tedious in comparison, but it required that you actually have a virtual dialogue with your prospects and learning what those likes and wants are, and even making promises to them that they'll get some or all of what they want. Finding a prospect's most important desire and then using it to steal that prospect from signing with a rival was exhilarating and fulfilling. Similarly, losing a prospect that you invested so much effort and time into could be equally heartbreaking, and it didn't feel quite as cheap when it happened. Those feelings hinged on the fact that you invested so much effort and time into recruiting the players. You kind of get to know them as people, in a sense. You remember their names, where they're from, which pitches are most important to them, what you've promised them, what you plan to promise them, and how they hopefully complement the other players on your team and on your recruiting board. That isn't all as true in NCAA 14, because so much of the process is automated and happens in the background. In fact, the designers at Tiburon seem to have recognized that NCAA 14's recruiting would be more hands-off, and that users would be less likely to be going into the recruiting screen every week. So they had to add notifications to the main Dynasty hub for when prospects were ready for campus visits or for when they sign with your school or another school, as well as some other potentially important milestones. In NCAA 13, this notification would pop up when the user entered the recruiting screen, and that worked fine because there was an expectation that the user would be going into the recruiting screen every week. Now, in all fairness, putting these messages on the main Dynasty hub is actually better UX design, as it guarantees that the user will see it, but the point here is that having a more hands-off approach to the recruiting necessitated such changes for NCAA 14, where it wasn't necessary in NCAA 13. Sure, at the end of the day, both games come down to numbers on a spreadsheet, but NCAA 13 obfuscated that fact with a layer of virtual human interaction. NCAA 14 basically stripped that layer of humanity away and removed almost all illusion that these prospects were anything more than a set of numbers in a spreadsheet, and your own interest in them was boiled down to just another number. Streamlining the process caused NCAA 14 to take a more hands-off approach to its recruiting, and I personally think that the game suffered for it. I think Tiburon could do better for EA Sports College Football in 2023 or 2024 or whenever it comes out. And I think a good place to start would be to look back at NCAA 13 for inspiration. In the next video, I will discuss my ideas for how the Dynasty mode could be improved for EA Sports College Football when it does release in July of 2023 or whenever, so stay tuned for that. A preview clip of the next episode is already available for my patrons, so if you enjoy this content, I hope you'll consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. Your support will help fund the creation of content like this by offsetting the cost of the editing software that I use to put these videos together, and also offsetting the cost of older games, such as NCAA Football 13 and 14, that I have to buy for research. I had made the stupid mistake of trading in my original NCAA 13 and 14 game discs long ago, so I had to go and re-buy used copies from GameStop and eBay in order to do the research for this video and to capture the clips that I've been using. So yeah, this video probably would not have happened without the support of my patrons. It also helps fund the maintenance of my website at www.megabearsfan.net. Patrons get exclusive previews of upcoming content, as well as early access to select content and the ability to vote on polls of potential future projects. I may add additional benefits as my support base grows. Also, as I hit my funding goals, I plan on making a matching donation to a charity or nonprofit that will be chosen by my patrons from a list of causes that are meaningful to me. You can also support the channel by sharing this content on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, or on any social media platform of your choice. And also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on YouTube and all that stuff. The extra exposure and support really does help, especially for a small growing channel like mine. I offer a sincere thanks to all of my patrons and all of my subscribers, as well as all of my blog readers and the viewers like you. Thanks for watching.